I never thought a single phone call could unravel everything I held dear about family. It was a Tuesday morning when a heavy thud jolted me awake. I rushed to the bathroom and found Jim, my husband of 43 years, collapsed beside the tub. His face was ashen, his breathing faint and uneven. Jim had always been a pillar of strength, stubborn as a mule, the kind of man who, at 79, still insisted on mowing the lawn despite his aching knees. Seeing him so fragile made my hands tremble as I dropped to his side. "Jim, sweetheart, can you hear me?" I whispered, pressing my fingers to his wrist, recalling the CPR class we'd taken years ago. His pulse was faint, irregular. Panic surged through me like a wildfire. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice asked questions I struggled to answer as Jim's breathing grew more labored. They promised an ambulance, but in our small town, that could take 20 minutes or longer. Desperate, I made the call that would change everything. I dialed Mike's number, my thumb lingering over his contact photo, a stiff snapshot from last Thanksgiving, where he stood next to Lauren, both looking like they'd rather be elsewhere. My son lived just 15 minutes away. Surely he'd rush over to help his father. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. But it wasn't Mike's familiar warmth. It was Lauren's sharp, annoyed tone. "What's wrong now, Maggie?" No greeting, no concern, just cold irritation that twisted my stomach. I tried to steady my voice, but it cracked. "Thank God you answered. Jim's collapsed. He's in bad shape. The ambulance is coming, but I'm terrified. Please, I need you and Mike here." Her response was a loud sigh, dripping with exasperation. "Really? We're in Italy, Maggie, on vacation, our first proper break in years." My breath caught. "Italy? Since when?" I stammered, glancing at Jim, whose lips were tinged blue. "We left Sunday. I posted it on Instagram. Maybe if you paid attention to our lives instead of obsessing over you and Jim, you'd know," she snapped. Her words stung like a slap. "Lauren, please, this is serious. He might be having a heart attack. I need Mike." Her tone turned condescending, the way she spoke when explaining apps to me. "Maggie, you're 67, you're not helpless. Call 911, get him to the hospital, whatever. Don't expect us to drop everything and fly back because Jim's having another one of his moments." She called his health scares moments, as if they were theatrics, not life-threatening emergencies. I pressed on, my voice breaking. "This isn't a moment, Lauren. He's unconscious, barely breathing. Please put Mike on." "Mike's at a spa treatment," she said. "We paid good money for this, and I'm not interrupting it because you can't handle a crisis like an adult. Deal with it." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, disbelief warring with dread. My daughter-in-law had just hung up on me while my husband lay dying. The silence confirmed what my heart already feared. When I needed them most, they weren't coming. The ambulance arrived 19 minutes later. By then, Jim was unresponsive. I sat in the back, clutching his cold hand as the paramedic worked with machines I couldn't comprehend. All I could hear was Lauren's voice. "Deal with it." Like caring for my dying husband was a minor inconvenience I should manage alone. At the hospital, they whisked Jim to the cardiac unit. I sat in the waiting room, still in my nightgown with a coat thrown over it, the fluorescent lights humming above me, the antiseptic smell turning my stomach. The hospital's sterile smell churned my stomach, and the incessant hum of the overhead lights made my head throb. I dialed Mike's number again, clinging to a faint hope that Lauren had misunderstood the gravity of the situation, that a bad connection had distorted my plea. This time, Mike answered. "Mom, Lauren said you called. I know you're worried, but Dad's been to the ER 3 times this year, remember? That chest pain in February was just indigestion, and the fainting spell in May was his blood pressure meds acting up." His voice was steady, almost patronizing, like he was reasoning with a child. In the background, I heard laughter, clinking glasses, and music, sounds of a carefree world while mine crumbled. "Mike, this isn't like those times," I said, my voice trembling. He collapsed. "He's in the ICU. They're talking about emergency surgery." "Mom, you always think the worst," he replied, calm as ever. "Like when you swore I had pneumonia and it was just a cough. The doctors have it under control. They always do. We'll be back in a week, and I bet Dad'll be fine by then." A week? My son thought his father's life could wait a week. "What if he's not fine?" I whispered, barely audible. "Then we'll handle it when we get back," he said dismissively. "But honestly, Mom, Dad's too tough to go anywhere. He'll probably outlive us all just to prove a point." He chuckled, a sound that cut through me as I sat just steps from where Jim fought for his life. "I've gotta go, Mom. We've got reservations at this incredible restaurant by the sea. Tell Dad I love him when he wakes up." The call ended abruptly. I sat in that plastic chair for hours, watching families rush by, spouses clinging to each other, children comforting parents, strangers offering support in their shared crises. Their unity only deepened my isolation. I felt more alone than ever before. At 3:12 a.m., Dr. Larson approached, his face heavy with news no words could soften. Jim was gone. A massive heart attack had torn through him, the damage too severe to repair. If we'd gotten him here sooner, if someone had been here to push for faster care. His voice trailed off, leaving a trail of futile what-ifs. I signed forms in a daze, nodding through explanations I couldn't process, haunted by Lauren's words. "Deal with it." And Mike's laughter ringing in my ears. Jim had died with only me by his side, while our son savored Italian dinners and our daughter-in-law indulged in spa retreats. They'd chosen a vacation over family, and now it was too late to choose anything else. As dawn broke, I sat in the hospital parking lot, watching the sunrise paint the sky over the town Jim and I had called home for 40 years. Something inside me had died too, not just my husband, but the belief that family would always stand by you, the part of me that excused Mike's indifference and Lauren's cruelty. I drove back to an empty house, steeling myself to plan a funeral, knowing that when Mike and Lauren returned from their perfect getaway, they'd face a version of me they weren't expecting. They arrived 2 days early from Italy, but not out of remorse. I was at the kitchen table, surrounded by condolence cards and funeral plans, when Lauren's voice carried through the front door before she even knocked. She was on her phone, whining to someone about cutting their trip short because of Jim's inconvenient timing. When I opened the door, Mike stood there, awkward in a rumpled black suit he'd clearly thrown on in haste. Lauren wore designer sunglasses despite the gray sky, her black dress screaming money, probably worth more than my weekly grocery budget. She was still on her call. I mean, who has a heart attack midweek? Couldn't he have waited till we were back? She caught my gaze and rolled her eyes. "Gotta go." The grieving widow's staring. Mike cleared his throat. "Mom, we're so sorry we couldn't be here. If we'd known it was this bad." My voice was flat, drained of tears. "You did know, Mike. I told you exactly how bad it was." Lauren lowered her sunglasses, meeting my eyes. "Maggie, honey, you can't expect us to guess when it's serious. Jim had so many false alarms before." Lauren's words cut deep, dismissing Jim's past health struggles as false alarms, as if his pain had been a mere inconvenience because he'd survived before. Mike stepped toward me, his arms half raised for a hug, but the steel in my stance stopped him cold. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice soft but hollow. "We'd have come if we'd known it was serious. We feel awful." "Are those of a loving son?" I searched his face for a glimpse of the boy who once teared up over a crushed ladybug, but all I saw was a performance of sorrow, the kind you offer to check a box. There was no real remorse, just the awkward weight of expectation. "The funeral's tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I said flatly. "St. Peter's Church." Lauren's voice spiked, incredulous. "Tomorrow? That's so soon. We're jet-lagged, barely processing this. Can't you push it back a few days?" I took in her flawless makeup, her polished nails, her hair perfectly styled despite the early flight. "Jim's been gone 5 days, I replied. "He can't wait for his family to feel ready." The funeral was everything Jim would have wanted. Simple, heartfelt, filled with the neighbors and friends who'd been part of our lives. The church overflowed with people who cherished Jim's kindness, his corny jokes, his readiness to lend a hand. Mr. Jenkins from across the street shared how Jim had cleared his driveway of snow every winter for over a decade. Mrs. Lee recounted how Jim rebuilt her garden gate after a storm, waiving off any payment. I sat in the front pew, soaking in these stories of the man I'd loved for 43 years, surrounded by a community that truly knew us. Mike and Lauren sat beside me, but they might as well have been strangers. Lauren checked her phone 4 times during the service, her thumbs scrolling through notifications. When the pastor invited memories, Mike stood and delivered a bland speech about Jim being a great dad and grandfather, words so generic they could have fit any obituary. No personal stories, no warmth, just a script. Afterward, people lined up to offer condolences. Jim's former co-workers, neighbors, friends from the community garden where we'd volunteered. Each shared a memory, a piece of Jim that warmed my heart. I was speaking with Clara Benson, Jim's old office assistant who'd driven 4 hours to attend, when I overheard Lauren on her phone behind a column. Her voice was casual, transactional. "Finally, we can do something with that beach cottage. It's just been sitting there, barely used. Have you seen the property prices out there? A renovation could turn it into something stunning." My heart froze. Clara's voice faded as Lauren's words consumed me. "This house will probably have to go too," she continued. "Maggie doesn't need all that space. A condo would suit her better at her age, don't you think?" Clara paused, noticing my expression. "Maggie, are you okay?" I mumbled an excuse and slipped toward the restroom, but Lauren's voice trailed me. "The life insurance will help," she said. "Jim was old school, so I'm sure he left Maggie plenty. She won't need to cling to properties she can't keep up with. It's just practical." I locked myself in a stall, my hands shaking. She was carving up Jim's life, our home, our memories, our 43 years together, right there at his funeral, his casket still surrounded by flowers. When I emerged, the receiving line had thinned, and most had moved to the church hall for the potluck the community women had organized. I stood alone in the sanctuary, staring at Jim's casket, trying to process Lauren's callousness. Then she approached, sunglasses back on, her stride confident, as if she were about to pitch a business deal. "Maggie, I hope it's okay, but Mike and I were thinking it might help if we went through Jim's things with you," she said, her tone syrupy. "You know, sorting what to keep, what to let go of. It's a big job for one person." I turned to face Lauren, her words still echoing in my mind. "Move along?" I repeated, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "You know how men collect things," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Tools, old books, clothes he hadn't worn in years. This house is full of clutter. It must feel overwhelming for you to handle alone." She stood close, her expensive perfume sharp in the air, her oversized sunglasses reflecting my face. In those lenses, I looked small, fragile, exactly the way she wanted me to see myself. "We could help you sort it all," she continued, her tone falsely kind. "Maybe start with the beach cottage, since it's such a big project. It needs so much work. And honestly, when would you even go there now?" The beach cottage. The little haven Jim and I bought 30 years ago with his first major bonus, where we celebrated every anniversary, where Mike learned to swim, where Jim and I planned our golden years. She spoke of it like it was already hers to claim. "That's kind of you, Lauren," I said, my calm surprising even me. Her lips curved into a smile, as if she'd scored a victory. "I'm glad you're being sensible," she said. "Jim would want you to make smart choices." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a practiced whisper of fake compassion. "Between us, Maggie, this is probably for the best. You and Jim were at an age where keeping up multiple properties was too much. Now you can focus on yourself. Focus on myself." As if Jim had been a burden, not my partner of 43 years. As if our life together was something to be shed like an old coat. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking sharply on the church floor, moving with the confidence of someone who'd just closed a deal. At my husband's funeral, as I said goodbye to the love of my life, she was already carving up our future. But as I stood there, something shifted inside me. The grief was still raw, heavy, but beneath it, a new resolve took root. Something solid, unshakable, built on the strength Jim had always seen in me, guiding me toward what had to be done. In the church hall, where neighbors shared stories and comfort food, Lauren sat at a corner table, flashing photos of Italy to anyone who'd listen. Mike nodded beside her, as if her behavior at his father's funeral was perfectly normal. I smiled through condolences, letting everyone see the grieving widow they expected. But inside, I was something else. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one they should fear most. 3 days after we laid Jim to rest, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee gone cold hours ago. The doorbell rang, and through the window, I saw a silver sedan in the driveway and a man in a crisp navy suit on my porch, holding a leather briefcase. I hesitated. The past week had been a blur of neighbors dropping off casseroles and insurance agents with endless forms. I wasn't ready for another reminder that I was a widow now, not a wife. But the man's calm, patient stance, no second ring, just waiting, made me open the door. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Robert Hayes from Hayes & Partners," he said. I was Jim's attorney. I blinked, confused. "Jim's attorney. We've used Carlson and Brown for our wills for over 20 years. Mr. Hayes nodded, his expression kind but serious. "Yes, ma'am. Carlson and Brown handled your family's standard legal matters, but about 6 months ago, Jim came to me for some private concerns." Private concerns? Jim had never mentioned another lawyer. In our 43 years together, we'd made every big decision as a team, drafting our wills at this very kitchen table with Mr. Carlson to keep things fair and simple. "There must be a mistake," I said. "Jim would have told me if he was changing anything." Mr. Hayes shifted his briefcase to his other hand, his eyes steady. "Mrs. Thompson, may I come in?" Robert Hayes asked, his voice steady but weighted. "There are details about Jim's final wishes you need to hear before the will is read next week." A chill settled in my gut. "What kind of details?" I asked. "The kind that might be hard to hear in front of your family," he replied gently. I let him in, leading him to the living room where Jim used to sit with his evening newspaper. Mr. Hayes took a seat across from me, placing his briefcase on the oak coffee table Jim had crafted 30 years ago with his own hands. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, "last October, Jim came to me deeply troubled. He'd overheard things about your family that changed how he wanted his estate handled." October. I racked my brain, trying to recall what might have upset Jim. It was around Mike's birthday, I remembered. A dinner party we'd hosted. Lauren had been her usual sharp self, but nothing stood out as alarming. "What did he hear?" I asked, my hands tightening in my lap. Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "What I'm about to share was recorded by accident," he said. Jim had installed a baby monitor system for his mother's visits. She had dementia, and he wanted to ensure her safety when she rested in the downstairs guest room. Jim's mother had passed away in November, only 5 months after moving in with us. The monitor was Jim's idea, with receivers placed around the house to alert us if she needed help. The system was highly sensitive, Mr. Hayes continued. It picked up conversations across the first floor, living room, kitchen, everywhere. My breath grew shallow. What did Jim hear? Mr. Hayes handed me a typed transcript, his expression somber. This is from October 15th, during Mike's birthday dinner. Jim was upstairs helping his mother settle in for the night. Your son and daughter-in-law were in the kitchen cleaning up. My hands trembled as I read the header. Audio recording, Michael and Lauren Thompson, October 15th, 10:52 p.m. The words blurred as I began to read. Lauren. These family dinners are exhausting. How much longer do we have to play along? Mike. What do you mean, Lauren? Lauren. Your parents aren't getting younger, Mike. Your dad's been to the ER, 3 times this year? And your grandmother's mind is gone. It's only a matter of time. Mike. That's pretty grim. Even for you. Lauren. It's realistic. They're sitting on valuable property and a solid life insurance payout. For what? So your mom can collect trinkets and your dad can tinker with pointless repairs? It's a waste. Mike. Keep it down, Lauren. They might hear. Lauren. They're upstairs. And I'm not saying anything awful, just that when they're gone, we'll finally have something to work with. That beach cottage alone is worth at least $450,000 now. This house? Easily $650. I stopped, my vision narrowing, nausea rising. Mr. Hayes nodded for me to keep going. Mike. I don't want to talk about this right now. Lauren. You should, because your mom's stubborn enough to live forever. Meanwhile, we're stuck in that cramped condo, pretending to care at these dinners while our real plans are on hold. Mike. What are you getting at? Lauren. I'm saying it wouldn't be the worst thing if your dad's next health scare was serious. And your mom? She'd be better off in one of those senior homes, socializing with people her age, not rattling around in this oversized house. Mike. Jesus, Lauren. Lauren. I'm talking about their quality of life, Mike. Wouldn't they be happier with proper care when they need it? Mike. And we'd be happier with their money? Lauren. Exactly. That's how inheritance works. Lauren's voice continued on the transcript, cold and calculating. The older generation passes on, leaving their wealth to the younger ones who can actually put it to good use. The document stretched on for pages, with Lauren outlining plans to overhaul the beach cottage and Mike tallying the value of Jim's life insurance. They spoke of us not as family, but as hurdles to their financial ambitions. My hands shook as I set the papers down. Jim heard all this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, ma'am, Mr. Hayes replied. He brought the recording to me a week later. Devastated doesn't begin to describe how he felt. I could imagine Jim upstairs, tucking his frail mother into bed, overhearing his son and daughter-in-law treat his death like a business deal. The betrayal must have wounded him deeper than any illness. He wanted to rewrite his will immediately, Mr. Hayes continued, but I urged him to take time to reflect. We set a meeting for December. What did he decide? I asked, my heart pounding. He pulled a thick document from his briefcase. Jim drafted a new will, separate from the one you created with Carlson and Brown. He placed his share of your joint assets, his life insurance, and his personal properties into a trust. I stared at the official papers, their weight sinking in. What kind of trust? The James Thompson Memorial Trust for Cardiac Care, he said. It funds emergency heart treatment for uninsured patients at the Regional Medical Center. The hospital's board manages it, with you as the sole beneficiary during your lifetime. My breath hitched. What does that mean? It means you have full access to the trust's assets while you're alive, Mr. Hayes explained. You can live in the house or the beach cottage, use investment income, cover your needs. But when you pass, everything goes to the hospital to support cardiac care. The room seemed to tilt. So Mike and Lauren get nothing? I asked. Not the cottage, not the insurance, not a cent of Jim's estate. The truth hit like a wave. Jim had heard his son plotting his death and responded by cutting him out completely, while ensuring I'd never be left vulnerable to their greed. There's more, Mr. Hayes said softly. Jim recorded other conversations in the months that followed. Would you like to hear them? I nodded, though my heart wasn't sure it could take more. He pressed play on a small digital recorder. Lauren's voice filled the room, sharp and icy, from a December evening while I was at my book club. I give Jim 6 months. Tops, she said. Old men don't last long after their mothers go. Honestly, it'd solve so much. Maggie's easy to handle. She'll do whatever Mike says. But Jim's so stubborn, he'd probably cling to this house until he's 90. Mike's voice came next. Mom's pretty tied to him. Lauren scoffed. She'll mourn for a bit, then see it's better this way. No more fretting over his health. No more rearranging her life for his doctor visits. Freedom. I reached over and stopped the recorder, unable to bear more. But I'd heard enough to understand why Jim had spent his final months quietly shielding me from the people I'd once called family. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Hayes said gently, there's one last thing. Jim specified when this should be revealed. After your family had a chance to show their true intentions about the estate. He suspected they'd pressure you to sell or sign over properties. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. Mike's name flashed on the screen. I glanced at Mr. Hayes, who gave an encouraging nod. I answered. Hey, Mom, Mike said, his voice warm, almost convincing. Lauren and I were wondering if you've thought about what we talked about at the funeral, helping you sort through Dad's stuff. If I hadn't read those transcripts, I might have believed his concern was real. Actually, Mike, I said, we should all sit down soon. There are things about your father's wishes we need to discuss. Great, he replied, too eager. How about tomorrow? We could start with the beach cottage paperwork, get things moving on the tricky stuff. I closed my eyes, Lauren's voice echoing in my mind. That beach cottage alone is worth $450,000 now. Tomorrow works perfectly, I said into the phone, my voice calm despite the storm within. Let's meet here at 2 o'clock. Great, Mom, Mike replied, his tone warm, almost too eager. We'll handle everything. Dad would have wanted us to help you with all this legal stuff. After hanging up, Mr. Hayes neatly packed his documents into his briefcase. Are you ready for tomorrow, Mrs. Thompson? He asked. I thought of Jim setting up those baby monitors to protect his mother, only to uncover the ugly truth about our son's priorities. I thought of Lauren appraising our life's worth at Jim's funeral, and the hospital room where Jim died alone while they savored Italian dinners. Mr. Hayes, I said firmly, I want copies of everything. Every recording, every transcript, every document Jim signed. Of course, he replied. And Mrs. Thompson, Jim left a message for you. For this moment. I braced myself. What did he say? He said to remember that the family you choose matters more than the one you're born into. Sometimes, protecting those you love means shielding them from the ones they care about. After he left, I sank into Jim's favorite armchair, surrounded by the living room we'd built together. Tomorrow, Mike and Lauren would walk in, expecting to carve up our life with their polished arguments and feigned concern, believing they could manipulate a grieving widow. They had no idea Jim had heard their every scheming word, that their greed had cost them everything they coveted, or that the quiet woman they underestimated now saw them for who they truly were. At exactly 2 p.m., I heard Lauren's voice through the front door before they knocked. Be gentle but firm, she instructed Mike. She's probably overwhelmed with all the paperwork. We're doing her a favor by taking charge. I opened the door to find them dressed like they were heading to a corporate meeting. Mike wore a sharp new suit I didn't recognize, while Lauren clutched an expensive leather portfolio, her hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing glasses she didn't need, her professional look, as I used to call it. "Mom, you look exhausted," Mike said, brushing a kiss on my cheek. "Have you been sleeping?" "As well as you'd expect," I replied, leading them to the living room where Mr. Hayes and I had spoken the day before. "Coffee?" I offered. "That'd be nice," Lauren said, settling into Jim's armchair as if it were hers. "But let's get to why we're here." She opened her portfolio with practiced efficiency, spreading documents across the coffee table. Property valuations, market reports, contacts for estate liquidators. She'd clearly spent hours preparing. "Maggie, I know this is tough to think about," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But we need to be practical. Jim left you with valuable assets, but they come with heavy responsibilities. The house, the beach cottage, taxes, upkeep. It's a lot for one person." I sat across from them, noting how Lauren had claimed Jim's chair, relegating me to the couch like a visitor in my own home. "I see you've done your homework," I said evenly. "Of course," she replied, picking up a sheet. "Did you know this house is valued at $675,000 now? That's a huge asset just sitting here." Mike leaned forward. "And the property taxes are over $9,000 a year. That's a big expense for a place too large for one person." I nodded slowly. "It is a big house." "Exactly," Lauren said, seizing the moment. "Think of the utilities, the maintenance, all the yard work Jim used to handle. You'd need to hire help, and that adds up fast." She slid another document toward me. "I found some wonderful senior communities nearby. Crestwood Gardens is lovely. Activities, on-site medical care, your own apartment without the burden of managing a whole house." I studied the glossy pamphlet Lauren slid across the table. It showed smiling seniors playing board games, joining art classes, and dining together in a bright communal hall. It looked comfortable enough, if you were ready to live like your life was already over. "This seems well thought out," I said evenly. "It is," Lauren replied, her voice brimming with false concern. "Imagine the peace of mind. If you had a medical emergency, help would be right there. No relying on neighbors or worrying about being alone." The irony wasn't lost on me. Lauren, who'd told me to deal with it when Jim collapsed, now pretending to care about my well-being. I kept my face neutral as she pressed on. "Now, about the beach cottage," she said, pulling out a stack of papers. "That place needs urgent work. The roof's at least 12 years old, the plumbing's outdated, and the wiring doesn't meet modern standards. We're talking major renovations just to make it livable." Mike nodded in agreement. "Dad was always patching things up instead of doing proper fixes," he said. "The foundation's got issues too." I thought of Jim's weekends at the cottage, lovingly maintaining every detail because it was our sanctuary. He'd rewired it himself 2 years ago, proud of balancing its charm with modern updates. "Have you had contractors inspect it?" I asked. Lauren and Mike exchanged a quick glance. "Not exactly," she admitted, "but coastal properties like that always have issues. Salt air, dampness, settling foundations. It's just how it is." She spread out what looked like renovation plans on the table. "But look at the potential," she said, her eyes gleaming. "With the right upgrades, open-plan living, a sleek kitchen, spa-inspired bathrooms, it could be stunning. The lot's big enough for a pool, maybe even a guest suite." I leaned closer, examining the documents. These weren't casual sketches. They were professional architectural blueprints, complete with measurements and specs. Someone had invested serious time and money. "These plans are very detailed," I said, my voice steady. When did you have them made? Lauren's cheeks flushed faintly. Oh, just some ideas we've been tossing around, she said airily. You know how I love design projects. I thought it'd help to see the possibilities. But the dates on the blueprints told a different story. November 10th, just 10 days after Jim's mother passed, months before his heart attack. Lauren had been planning to overhaul our cottage while Jim was still alive, while we were still escaping to it for weekends. The thing is, Mike said, seemingly oblivious to my discovery, renovations like this are pricey, $250,000 at least, but post-upgrade, the property could easily fetch $750,000. Of course, Lauren added quickly, that's only if you wanted to sell it later. Honestly, Maggie, when would you use a beach cottage now? It's a lot of hassle and expense for a place that'd sit empty most of the time. I set the plans down carefully. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this, I said. We just want what's best for you, Mike said, his voice soft. Dad always worried about leaving you with too much to manage. He used to say he wanted things simpler for you. That was a lie. Jim had never said anything like that. If anything, he'd worried about me feeling alone, insisting the cottage was a place where I could feel close to him after he was gone. Actually, Lauren said, her tone suddenly bright, I have a solution that could work for everyone. She pulled out another set of documents. What if Mike and I took over the beach cottage renovation? We'd handle the contractors, the timeline, all the stress. You could focus on settling into your new place without worrying about a construction project. I glanced at the papers she handed me. Contracts granting Mike and Lauren full authority over the cottage's renovation, including choosing contractors, approving costs, and managing the project. This seems very generous, I said, but it's a lot of work for you. Lauren's smile was tight, not reaching her eyes. We'd be investing our time and effort, she said, to make things easier for you. There it was, their true motive laid bare. Naturally, Lauren said, her voice smooth. When the cottage is sold, we'd need to recover our investment, plus a fair profit. They wanted me to hand over the beach cottage, fund its renovation with my money, and then let them claim most of the proceeds. It was a scheme dressed up as generosity, designed to profit from Jim's death. What kind of profit? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Mike shifted in his seat, uneasy. We haven't nailed down the specifics, he said. Lauren jumped in, unruffled. Maybe a 60-40 split, since we'd be handling all the work and risk. 60%. They wanted 60% of a cottage Jim and I had owned for 30 years, paid for with his overtime hours, filled with our cherished memories of anniversaries and family summers. And this house? I asked, glancing around. Well, Lauren said, you'd need to sell it to cover the buy-in for Crestwood Gardens, but you'd still have plenty left over. No more property taxes, utilities, or upkeep costs. You'd come out ahead. I looked at the bookcases Jim had built, the mantel lined with family photos, the window nook where I'd read countless novels. They were talking about dismantling my life as if it were a math problem. That's a lot to take in, I said calmly. Of course, Mike said, leaning forward. But the sooner we start, Mom, the sooner you can let go of these burdens. Lauren nodded. Grief makes everything harder. It's better to tackle the practical stuff now, while you have us to help. Help. They called their attempt to strip me of my home and Jim's legacy help. I do have a question, I said. How would you finance a $250,000 renovation for the cottage? Their eyes flicked to each other. Well, Mike said slowly, you could take out a home equity loan against this house. Rates are low, and with the property's value, you'd qualify easily. A cold weight settled in my chest. They wanted me to mortgage my home to pay for their dream project, risking my security so they could profit. Or, Lauren added brightly, if you sold this house now, you could use some of the proceeds. Either way, it's a win. She pulled out a calculator, her fingers flying over the keys with practiced ease. Say $675,000 from the house sale, minus $65,000 for Crestwood Gardens. That leaves you nearly $610,000. Use $250,000 for the cottage renovation, and you've still got $360,000 earning interest, plus the cottage's value climbing. It was a polished pitch. They'd anticipated every objection, crafted answers that made their plan sound logical, even caring. If I hadn't heard Jim's recordings, hadn't listened to them plot his death like a business deal, I might have bought their concern. You've really planned this out, I said. We have, Lauren said, beaming with pride. It's complex, but once it's sorted, your life will be so much easier, Mike added. We'll handle the paperwork, the decisions, everything. You won't have to lift a finger. I looked at my son, searching for the boy who once handed me dandelions, calling them flowers, but saw only a man who'd weighed his father's life against property values and found it lacking. Well, I said, gathering their documents. This gives me plenty to think about. Lauren leaned forward, pulling out a pen with a flourish, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. If you're okay with the plan, she said, we could start the paperwork now. The cottage management agreement is simple, and these things can drag if you don't stay on top of them. I stared at the pen Lauren held out, then at the contract spread across my coffee table, and finally at their expectant faces. They thought they'd won, certain the grieving widow would sign away her home and Jim's legacy, swayed by their polished pretense of concern. You know, I said, standing abruptly, I think I should talk to Jim's lawyer first, just to understand the legal side of all this. The air in the room grew heavy, as if the temperature had plummeted. Lauren's smile froze, unnatural and strained. Oh, that's not necessary, she said quickly. Mr. Carlson knows your situation. These are standard arrangements. Actually, I replied, I meant Jim's other lawyer, Mr. Hayes. Their eyes widened slightly. Did you know Jim was working with another attorney recently? The glance they exchanged confirmed they had no idea about Mr. Hayes. Lauren's grip tightened on her pen. Another lawyer? Mike's voice was measured, but tension laced his words. What for? Apparently, Jim had some concerns about his estate, I said, watching Lauren closely. Mr. Hayes is coming by tomorrow to go over Jim's final wishes with all of us. For a split second, her composure cracked, a flicker of panic crossing her face before she masked it. Well, she said with a forced laugh, I'm sure it's nothing major. Jim always wanted things simple for you. But her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers, and Mike sat unusually silent. They left with vague promises to call and reminders not to delay important decisions. From the front window, I watched their car's taillights fade down the street. They had no clue that tomorrow's meeting wasn't about Jim's wishes. It was about their own recorded betrayal. As I thought of their architectural plans, dated from when Jim was still alive, a chill ran through me. They hadn't just been waiting for his death. They'd been plotting to profit from it before it even happened. Tomorrow, they'd learn Jim had heard every word. The next morning, I woke with a strange calm, the first sense of purpose I'd felt since Jim's death. I brewed coffee in his favorite mug and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunrise through the window where he used to read his paper. At 10 a.m., Mr. Hayes arrived, carrying a larger briefcase and moving with the precision of someone ready to execute a well-laid plan. Are you ready for this, Mrs. Thompson? He asked as we settled in the living room. I've been ready since I heard those recordings, I said. Jim protected me, even after he was gone. The least I can do is honor that. Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase, arranging documents on the coffee table with meticulous care. Let's go over how this will unfold, he said. First, I'll review the original will from Carlson and Brown, the one your family thinks is still in place. Then, I'll present Jim's new will and the trust documents. Finally, we'll play key parts of the recordings. My pulse quickened, but I nodded. How do you think they'll react? From experience, he said, denial first, then anger, then desperate bargaining. Be prepared, Mrs. Thompson. They may say hurtful things. When people lose something they've counted on, they often lash out, especially when they've brought it on themselves. At 11 a.m., I heard car doors slam in the driveway. Through the window, I saw Mike and Lauren approaching the house. Lauren clutched her leather portfolio, a bulky handbag, and a folder that looked like real estate listings, clearly expecting to leave with signed contracts. I opened the door before they could knock. Mike, Lauren, come in, I said. Mr. Hayes is here to discuss your father's estate. Lauren's smile wavered when she saw the lawyer's briefcase and the neatly arranged documents, but she quickly recovered. Perfect, she said brightly. It's always good to have expert advice during these transitions. She settled into Jim's armchair again, spreading her papers on a side table with an air of ownership. Mike sat on the couch, his eyes darting to Mr. Hayes with barely concealed unease. Mr. Hayes began, his tone calm and professional. I understand you've been discussing Mrs. Thompson's housing plans and the handling of certain properties. Exactly, Lauren said smoothly. We're just trying to support Maggie through these tough decisions. Very considerate, Mr. Hayes replied. And I assume you're familiar with the original will drafted by Carlson and Brown? Mike nodded. Yeah, Dad always said he wanted things straightforward, split everything evenly between Mom and me, with Mom getting the house and his life insurance. Mr. Hayes inclined his head. That was the original plan. However, there have been changes that alter those terms. Lauren's composed expression tightened, a flicker of tension in her jaw. What changes? She asked. 6 months ago, Mr. Hayes said, your father-in-law approached me with concerns about his estate. He'd learned things that prompted him to rethink how his assets should be distributed. Mike's voice sharpened. What things? Mr. Hayes reached into his briefcase and pulled out the digital recorder. Jim had installed a baby monitor system to ensure his mother's safety during her final months. It inadvertently captured conversations in this house. The color drained from Lauren's face. Mike leaned forward, his hands balled into fists. I don't get it, Lauren said, her voice losing its polished edge. What does that have to do with the will? Everything, Mr. Hayes said simply. He pressed play. Lauren's voice filled the room, cold and unmistakable. These family dinners are exhausting. How much longer do we have to play along? Mike's voice followed, and I watched his face as he heard himself respond, realizing every callous word, every comment about Jim's death being convenient, every calculation of our property values had been recorded. When the recording reached Lauren's line about hoping Jim's next health scare would be serious, she lunged for the device. Turn that off. That's illegal. You can't record us without permission. Mr. Hayes calmly moved the recorder out of reach. In this state, recording conversations in your own home is legal, especially when the system was installed for legitimate safety purposes. These recordings are valid evidence of your intentions regarding Jim's estate. Mike's voice was desperate. Those were taken out of context. We were just talking hypothetically about the future. Were you? Mr. Hayes held up the architectural plans Lauren had shown me yesterday. These renovation plans for the beach cottage are dated November 10th, when Jim was still alive and using the property. It seems you were making very specific plans for assets you didn't yet own. Lauren's hands trembled as she stared at the blueprints. Those were just concepts, design ideas, she stammered. There's nothing wrong with exploring options. Perhaps, Mr. Hayes said, but paired with recordings expressing hope for your father-in-law's death and detailed calculations of his life insurance, these plans reveal a clear picture of your motives. Mr. Hayes opened a thick folder and placed a legal document on the coffee table. "This is your father's response to what he discovered," he said. "The James Thompson Memorial Trust for Cardiac Care, established December 18th last year." Mike scanned the first page, his face growing ashen with each line. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Your father's revised will," Mr. Hayes replied. "His share of all joint assets, his life insurance, and his personal properties, including the beach cottage, are now in an irrevocable trust." Lauren's voice was barely audible. "A trust for what?" "Emergency cardiac care for uninsured patients," Mr. Hayes said. Jim was clear about his reasons. After his family failed to support him during his medical crisis, he wanted to ensure others wouldn't face the same abandonment. The room fell silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock Jim had inherited from his father. Mike and Lauren sat frozen, their financial dreams collapsing under the weight of the truth. "This can't be legal," Lauren finally said, her voice sharp. "You can't just cut out your family. There are laws." Mr. Hayes shook his head. "In this state, you have no legal claim to your parents-in-law's estate. Jim was free to allocate his assets as he chose." Mike's voice wavered. "But the beach cottage? We've been helping maintain it." "Have you?" Mr. Hayes produced a stack of maintenance receipts. "These show Jim handled all repairs and upkeep himself. There's no record of any contributions from either of you." Lauren's voice rose. "We put in time, cleaning, organizing." I nearly laughed. Lauren had been to the cottage twice in 2 years, each time griping about its outdated kitchen and bathrooms. Mr. Hayes turned to me. "Mrs. Thompson, as the surviving spouse, you have full access to the trust's assets during your lifetime. You can live in the house or cottage, use investment income, and decide on maintenance or upgrades. Upon your passing, everything goes to the hospital foundation." Mike's eyes widened. "What does that mean for us?" "It means," I said quietly, "you get exactly what you planned for me after pushing me into Crestwood Gardens." "Nothing." Lauren leapt to her feet. "This is your fault. You turned Jim against his own son." Mr. Hayes cut in, calm but firm. "Mrs. Thompson had no knowledge of these changes until after Jim's death. The recordings show he acted solely based on what he heard from you." He played another clip, Lauren's voice chilling the room. "Maggie's easy to handle. She'll do whatever Mike says." I stood, facing them. "Jim realized you weren't waiting to inherit," I said. "You were waiting for us to die." Mike shook his head weakly. "That's not true." But his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I pressed. "You went to Italy while your father was dying. Lauren told me to deal with it while Jim fought for his life alone in a hospital." "We didn't know it was that serious," Lauren said, but her words sounded hollow, even to her. "You didn't care to know," I replied. "Jim's death was an inconvenience to your vacation, not a family tragedy." Mr. Hayes gathered his papers with brisk efficiency. "That covers everything," he said. "Mrs. Thompson, you have my contact information. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I suggest consulting your own attorney if you have questions about the trust, though Jim included language to prevent any challenges." After he left, a heavy silence settled. Lauren stared at the trust documents, as if she could force them to change. Mike opened and closed his mouth, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, Lauren spoke, her voice low. "You could fight this, Maggie. We're family. We could challenge the trust together." I looked at her, almost pitying her. Even now, after hearing Jim had caught every cruel word, she thought she could sway me. "Lauren," I said softly, "I was married to Jim for 43 years. I loved him more than life itself," I said, my voice steady. "Why would I challenge a will that honors his memory and helps people facing the same crisis he did?" Lauren's face twisted with anger. "Because Mike's your son. Family's supposed to mean something." "It does," I replied. It means I raised Mike to be better than this. It means Jim loved him enough to give him every chance to care about more than money. I turned to the window, gazing at the garden Jim had planted for me, now quiet in the late winter chill, but poised to bloom come spring. You want to know what family means? It's remembering the boy who built birdhouses with his dad in the garage. It's loving someone so much it breaks your heart when they choose greed over loyalty. When I faced them again, tears streamed down their faces, but I felt only a deep calm. Jim had shielded me from their betrayal, and now I understood why. 6 months later, I stood in the cardiac wing of Regional Medical Center, watching Dr. Larson guide a young woman, maybe 30, through treatment options for her husband, who'd suffered a severe heart attack. 2 small children clung to her, fear etched in their eyes. "The surgery's costly," Dr. Larson said gently, "but the James Thompson Memorial Trust can cover it if you qualify." "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just be with your family," he replied. "The trust takes care of the rest." I stood quietly in the hall, watching this woman receive the help that might have saved Jim if it had existed 6 months ago. The trust had already funded 14 emergency procedures, and the hospital was expanding its cardiac unit to meet growing demand. This was Jim's legacy, not wealth for ungrateful heirs, but lives saved, families preserved in their darkest hours. My phone buzzed with another text from Mike. He'd been reaching out for weeks, ever since his divorce from Lauren was finalized. Word from mutual friends was that she'd left him the moment she realized there'd be no inheritance, no beach cottage profits, no early retirement funded by our deaths. "Mom, can we talk? I know I messed up, but I'm your son. Please." I deleted the message, as I had the others. Some betrayals cut too deep for apologies, revealing truths too stark to unlearn. The young woman passed by with her children, heading to the elevator. Her husband would live, would return to his family, because of Jim's final act of love. A warmth filled my chest, the first I'd felt since finding Jim on our bathroom floor. At home, I kept the house despite everyone's advice to downsize. It no longer felt empty without Jim, but peaceful, free of those who saw it as a prize. I'd changed the locks and upgraded the security system. Mike and Lauren no longer had access to walk through my life, plotting my future. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee and sat at the table where Jim used to read his paper, where we'd dreamed of our retirement. I opened the photo album I'd been compiling, snapshots of our 43 years, from our shy wedding pictures to our last anniversary dinner. Jim smiled from every page, teaching Mike to ride a bike, painting the nursery before Mike was born, walking him down the aisle at his wedding to Lauren, both hopeful for a future that never came. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my memories. Through the window, I saw Mr. Hayes's familiar silver sedan. He stood on the porch, not with his usual briefcase, but holding a small wrapped package. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I have something for you." I invited him in, curious about this Saturday visit. "Jim left this with me," he said, handing me the package, "to be given to you 6 months after the trust was established and running." My hands shook as I unwrapped a small wooden box, its intricate carvings unmistakably Jim's handiwork from his workshop. Inside was a letter in his familiar scrawl and a small silver key. "My dearest Maggie," it began, "if you're reading this, 6 months have passed since you learned the truth about our family." I paused, overcome by the sound of Jim's voice in his words. "I hope by now the shock has settled, and you see why I made these choices." My eyes stung as I read on. "The key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Inside is the deed to a cabin in Montana I bought last year. I kept it secret, planning to surprise you for our 50th anniversary. It's by a lake, nestled among mountains with everything you need for a quiet, peaceful life. My breath caught. Jim had purchased a hidden retreat, a place for us to escape together. You may wonder why I didn't tell you about the trust before I died. I hoped I was wrong about Mike and Lauren, that they'd choose family over money in a crisis. I gave them every chance to prove me wrong. Tears blurred the page as I continued, but I also knew that if they didn't change, you'd need protection from their greed. You've always been too generous, too ready to sacrifice for others. I couldn't let you spend your later years manipulated by those who saw you as a barrier to their inheritance. The letter described the cabin vividly: a wide porch for watching sunrises over the lake, a stone fireplace for cozy winter evenings, a garden patch for growing flowers and vegetables. You don't have to go there if it doesn't feel right. The cabin is yours to use or sell as you choose, but if the memories at home grow too heavy, or the loneliness too much, you have a place to start anew. The final lines broke me. I love you more than I can say, Maggie. You gave me 43 years of joy, and I hope I gave you the same. Live for yourself now, not for ungrateful children, manipulative relatives, or friends who think they know best. Be free, my darling. Truly, gloriously free. After Mr. Hayes left, I sat with Jim's letter and the silver key, feeling a spark of excitement for the future, something I hadn't felt in months. I looked around our home, its rooms filled with memories, and faced a choice. Stay here, tethered to the past, waiting for Mike to grasp what he'd lost, or embrace Jim's gift and build something new. That night, I called the airline and booked a flight to Montana, not to move yet, but to see the haven Jim had chosen for us, free of family obligations and societal pressures. 3 days later, I stood on the porch of a cozy log cabin overlooking a serene mountain lake. Jim had chosen perfectly, remote enough for solitude, yet equipped for year-round comfort. Inside, I found a stocked kitchen, a bedroom with windows facing the sunrise, and a living room anchored by the stone fireplace he'd described. On the mantel was a final surprise: a framed photo from our honeymoon, Jim's arm around me, both of us beaming, and a note in his handwriting. "Welcome home, my love." I spent a week there, walking lakeside paths Jim had explored when finalizing the purchase, sitting on the porch watching eagles glide through the morning mist, rediscovering a piece I thought I'd lost forever. Back home, I found 19 missed calls from Mike and a frantic voicemail from Lauren. "Maggie, I know you hate me, but please listen. I was awful, selfish, cruel. I get why Jim cut us out. But Mike's falling apart. He lost his job. The divorce took everything, and he's in a dark place. He needs his mom. Please." I deleted it without responding. Jim's letter was clear: live for myself, not for children who only remembered me when they needed something. Instead, I called Dr. Larson at the hospital. "I'd like to expand the trust," I said. "I want to add a grief counseling program for families who lose loved ones to cardiac emergencies." "That's a beautiful idea, Mrs. Thompson," he replied. "What inspired it?" I gazed out the kitchen window at Jim's garden, now vibrant with the flowers he'd planted for their meaning, blooming as if he were still here. Forget-me-nots for remembrance, sunflowers for devotion, roses for eternal love, I said to Dr. Larson. Sometimes it's not just those who lose someone who need healing. It's the ones left behind who need to learn how to build a life worth living. A year later, I divided my time between the home Jim and I had shared and the Montana cabin he'd gifted me. I volunteered 3 days a week at the hospital, guiding other widows through the emotional and practical challenges of sudden loss. At the cabin, I'd learned to kayak on the lake, my paddle slicing through the still water, and planted a garden that drew hummingbirds and butterflies. Mike still called now and then, usually late at night, his voice thick with liquor and regret. I recognized the cycle: anger, self-pity, empty promises to change. I listened to his voicemails but never responded. Some lessons come only through consequences, and some bonds can't survive the truth of what they were built on. On Jim's birthday, I drove to the cemetery with flowers from both gardens, the one he'd planted at home and the one I'd cultivated at the cabin. Kneeling by his headstone, I shared stories of the lives his trust had saved, the families spared the pain we'd endured. "You were right about everything," I whispered. "About Mike, about Lauren, about what I needed to be happy. I miss you every day, but I'm not lonely anymore. I'm not afraid. I'm free." As I walked back to my car, I spotted a familiar figure by the cemetery gate. Mike, gaunt and disheveled, his clothes worn and faded, stood waiting, watching until I'd finished with Jim. "Mom," he said softly as I approached. "Please, just 5 minutes." I looked at my son, the man I'd raised, loved, and lost to his own greed, and felt something unexpected. Not anger, but pity. Not the kind that opens the door to forgiveness, but the kind that sees someone's self-inflicted ruin and finds it tragic rather than enraging. "I know what you'll say," I told him. "You're sorry. You've learned. You want another chance to be the son I raised." He nodded eagerly. "Yes, all of that. I've been in therapy, trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt you and Dad like that." "Good," I said. "I hope therapy helps you find peace." His eyes lit up. "Does that mean we can try again? Can I visit? Maybe call sometimes?" I studied this broken man, my son in name but no longer in heart. "Mike," I said gently, "I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It doesn't rebuild trust from ashes." His face crumpled. "But I'm your son." "You were," I said. "And maybe if you do the work to become someone worthy of that bond, we might find a way back. But that's your path, not mine to wait for." I walked past him to my car, each step lighter. "Mom, please," he called. "I have no one else." I turned back one last time. "Neither did I said. When your father was dying, when I needed my family most, I was alone. But I built a life worth living anyway. You can too." I drove away without a backward glance, heading home to pack for another week at the cabin. The mountains beckoned, the lake shimmered, and I had a life to live. Not for others, but for myself, gloriously free. Jim had given me the greatest gift, the freedom to choose joy over duty, peace over guilt, my dreams over others' expectations. At 66, I was finally, beautifully free. I wonder, though, what would you do in my place? Have you ever faced a betrayal that forced you to redefine family or find your own path? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Meanwhile, I carry two other stories close to my heart, tales of resilience and rediscovery that might surprise you, just as mine has.